Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Come on. Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock. You've had a long day. Yeah, let's get some claps. Let's do it. Yes, human rights. That's the spirit we want. It's the end of a long day, but I'm going to argue we have saved the best for last. And I know we've been immersed all day in the world of Autocracy Inc., where authoritarian governments are creating a global environment that protects their rule and serves their interests while undermining those of liberal democracies. So how are they doing this? I think you've heard from many people today, both in your small groups and in our last panel, about how authoritarians are surveilling and repressing speech and assembly, not just inside their borders, but outside of their borders with transnational repression. They're controlling critical resources like oil. They're sowing conflict and instability, and they're expanding their own spheres of influence. I think you heard in the last session that this is done not just bilaterally, but also through multilateral institutions like the United Nations. China, Russia, and other authoritarian actors are actively seeking to weaken and manipulate multilateral institutions and norms from within. You also heard, including in the last session, about the goal of authoritarians to silence criticism of their closed and repressive governments and to stymie meaningful and coordinated international responses to their behavior. So, in the face of all of this depressing news, what we're here to do in this session is to discuss how we refuse to play along. Because where autocracy is at its core is brittle, democracy's inherent capacity to renew and course correct enables flexibility, inclusion, and resilience in pursuing peace and prosperity for their own people and people across the globe. So, today's Human Rights Defender Award recipients, including the one sitting next to me, exemplify the creativity, passion, dedication, and international collaboration critical to standing up to Autocracy Inc. and for calling for the US and admittedly their authoritarian allies and partners to change their behavior. So we're here to discuss the next steps, the action plan, the strategy of how to move forward to defend democracy. I am joined by two brilliant panelists, both of whom I am nearly sure I've met in the past, and we've been discussing for several minutes how we have been in the same place at the same time. Nicholas Opio is a leading human rights lawyer and the founder of Chapter 4 Uganda, an organization that provides robust and strategic responses to the abuse of civil liberties in Uganda. He's also currently a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Mr. Opio has spent his career defending human rights. He was a key leader in drafting and advocating for Uganda's Uganda's law criminalizing torture, and he is very well known for fighting against the notorious Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2013, which was declared null and void in 2014. For his work as a reward, Mr. Opio has been threatened, spied upon, persecuted, and imprisoned. But he has also received innumerable awards and commendations for his tireless work, and we are absolutely honored to be speaking with him today. We also have Nino Lomjaria, who is a Georgian lawyer and public defender, of course, as I mentioned, a State Department Human Rights Defender awardee this year. Under her leadership, the Georgia Public Defender's Office was widely considered the most independent democratic institution in Georgia. She also has extensive international and domestic election observation experience. She is the former executive director of the International Society for Fair Elections and Democracy, Georgia's largest election monitoring nonprofit organization. She has served as the Secretary General of the European Network of Election Observer Organizations and is a board member of the European Platform of Democratic Elections. I think I know her from my time at USAID Georgia in 2008 when she worked at the Georgian Young Lawyers Association. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. Could we get a brief round of applause for our esteemed panelists? So I'm going to start the questioning with Nino. As a public defender, your role was to represent and defend the human rights of all Georgian citizens to the government, and oftentimes under intense political pressure from that same government. You have described how your impartial and professional work was to build a democratic state that lives up to Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So, reflecting on your career, what are the biggest steps that Georgia needs to take to fight authoritarianism and build a democratic state?
Thank you for this introduction. Yes, I am coming from the country which for many, many years was proud for democratic reforms. We've been for many years an exemplary country in the region, and for many countries for anti-corruption and like other kind of democratic reforms. But during last several years, Georgia has democratic backsliding. And you know, probably like a few years ago, if I have heard my country together with the words of autocracy or authoritarianism, I would be deeply upset about it. But today, we are talking about, we are talking about that it's not democracy, but what is going on in Georgia, it's like we are going towards autocracy, and we're going towards authoritarian regime. We sometimes also mention the word state capture and terms like that, which is alarming. And now, you know, I have to, and we are like discussing how we came to this point, because just a few years ago, we were proud for our democratic reforms again, in the region, in Eastern Europe, Georgia was one of the like example state for other countries because of those achievements. So how we came to this point? This is the question, and this is something that everybody should, you know, think about. That it is if we keep blind eyes to some wrongdoings and some wrong processes in any country, we could come to this point, and it can get even worse in the future. And this is what I am really afraid of. One thing that I want to mention is that the types of governments prone to autocracy type of governments and regimes, they are very good in communications. In communication, not only with its population and citizens, but with international democratic stakeholders as well. And how it has started? Regimes are very good at like persuading international community that democratic actors like human rights defenders, like journalists, civil society organizations are producing non-qualified reports, or they are biased. They spread like conspiracies about the real intentions of democratic actors in the country. And it works, you know, they nicely persuade the international community that they should have some suspicious towards the real intentions of democratic actors in the country. And it, I would say, worked, if I may say it, because some, you know, international community, some donors as well, you know, tried to distance themselves from certain democratic actors in the country. As you know, international community wants to, you know, and it's very natural to keep communication and cooperation with the governments. They try to now balance their policy and to not to provide support to those human rights defenders or actors who are very critical towards the government, who are very toxic, and which are unacceptable for the governments. But I think this is a big mistake that any international stakeholder is making, and it has been proved in Georgia, because I think that the solution is that in such situations, those actors needs to be supported, which can bring changes to the country and which are fighting for changes in the country. And the international community should provide support to those actors which are unacceptable for those type of governments, because I mean, if you continue supporting providing support to institutional support to the government and government-controlled institutions, this maybe you might have really good intentions, but it does not bring changes because those type of governments, they don't want to change anything because they are comfortable in this situation. They want full control over the situation, over the independent institutions. So I think that it is not the right, I mean, international support and the strategy of the support needs to be revised, and more attention and more support should be directed to those groups, individuals, for journalists, media outlets, and etc., who are very critical, who puts government in uncomfortable situation, and who are not acceptable and are perceived by the governments as opponents and as an their political opponents. So there needs to be strengthened the support towards these people.
Great, thank you. And that's such a good thing to point out, that authoritarian actors are very well coordinated and they have good communication plans, and they like to spread narratives, oftentimes false narratives. So it's incumbent upon democratic actors, including both human rights defenders and their international supporters, to rally around a common vision and a common narrative about the importance of democracy. I think we hear a lot that if authoritarians are coordinated, the only way to battle them is for democracies and democratic actors to also be coordinated. A follow-up question I just have for you is, you talk about donors in the international community, therefore going out of their way to fund civic actors, journalists, media who are able to be critical of autocratic actors or critical of the government. What role do you think does donor coordination play in that? Do you think donors need to be better at having a common vision together? Oftentimes in places like Georgia, there are so many different countries trying to fund civil society or media.
Yes, I absolutely.
I think your mic.
Yes, I think that there is the need of better coordination among the donor community, because on the other hand, the regimes are well coordinated. They have developed their strategy of communication. They spend a lot of resources, including financial resources, on the strategic communication and propaganda. And this propaganda requires counter propaganda from democratic actors. And well, I think that first of all, the international community and donor community should name its name to the situation, what is going on. And if you see that the government is no more democratic, and the only goal that they have is to keep their power and to prolong their stay in the power, then the donor should revise their strategy of their support to the country. First of all, there is the need to determine your policy towards the country. And then there is the need of, again, coordination with the donor community, and joint efforts are needed to confront propaganda of autocratic regimes. It is well. I just want to make clear. I do not put the burden of democratic transition in any country on the international community or donor community. I absolutely understand that this is something that the citizens of particular countries should take responsibility for. But what I'm trying to explain is that when we are confronting strong power, autocratic regimes, which are sometimes backed even with stronger autocratic regimes. One, for instance, one of our neighbors, for instance. It requires more coordinated and more better planned counter response. And just like human rights defenders or individuals or some like activists, democracy activists or freedom fighters in particular countries, they cannot confront the strong power, and they need to be supported, to be encouraged, to be backed by international democratic community. And yes, I think that if early interventions is always will always bring results, and also we should also remember that maybe tomorrow, maybe after 1 year, maybe 2 years, the autocracy will be more like cemented and strengthened, and it might be even more difficult after 1 year, 2 years to change something. And it is very important to act timely, and I mean, when there is no hope that governments would implement or change, or carry out democratic reforms, it means that you don't have to wait, because when you see the clear signs that there is no political will for democratic transformation, it means that you have to revise your support and direct all your support to those people or group or individuals or movements or political actors maybe, or media actors who are ready to bring changes.
Thank you. That's a lot of good advice for donors and international communities to support sort of the vision of local democracy defenders, better coordination, undertaking joint efforts, the early intervention point, which applies to democracy and peace building, which is always easy to prevent a crisis than respond to a crisis. And of course, doing our favorite thing ever, stakeholder analysis, to be really careful about who we're supporting and why. Which brings me to Nicholas. You were a member of the team of experts to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to peaceful assembly and association. You've done advocacy around the UN General Assembly. You were vocal about human rights being addressed at last December's US-Africa Leaders Summit. So what are your thoughts on more concrete things the international community can do to empower and protect human rights defenders in the face of autocratic threats?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your very warm introduction, and thank you for having me this evening. I have a couple of concrete ideas. Some of them are wild, but I'll throw them out there. Let's see what works and see what doesn't.
That sounds good for nearly 5 p.m. on a Thursday. We want wild ideas.
The first is the concept of raising the cost of the perversion of the democratic process. I think that actions of the global West has not matched their rhetorics. We have seen over and over again the passing of legislation that calls for sanctions against abuse of fundamental rights and freedoms, without actions to follow the implementation of those legislations. And as such, the king of Eswatini can kill an activist knowing that he can get away with it. President Museveni in Uganda will disappear activists, will torture opponents, knowing that there is no cost to pay. So the first thing that I think is really important for people to reflect on is raising the cost and making sure that we follow those commitments with actions. The US has passed the Global Magnitsky Act. I think Canada has done the same. The EU has done the same. And yet you can count on your fingers how many people have been subjected to this legislation in the face of the pervasive, rampant, widely reported cases of mass and grave human rights violations on the continent. In Uganda, as we speak today, 6 years ago, the government of Uganda went to the Eastern District of Kasese, the Western District of Kasese, and massacred in 2 days well over 180 people, including children as young as 6 years old, and mothers who were expecting. Nothing happened. We made noise about it. People know about this. Nothing happened. So I think first we must raise the cost of violations of fundamental rights and freedoms through the implementation of legislations like the GLOMAC. The second thing is, I think that many African states are performing democracy as opposed to practicing democracy. It's performative democracy, like actors go to a stage and perform and we laugh. They stage a performance of democracy without the fundamental guarantees of a democratic state. And we are happy to hold them as bastions and champions of democratic countries. They hold elections that are fraudulent, and then we just do nothing about it. Look at the example of Uganda, look at Kenya. Really, I think that more activists have been shot and killed in Kenya than they have in Uganda. And yet we think of Kenya as a very democratic and powerful country. And so we must recognize and push back against performative democracies by supporting pro-democracy movements that are on the ground. With resources, with spaces to speak and ventilate their concerns. We have African-US leaders summits in Washington, D.C., where civil society sits on the side, sometimes 4 kilometers away from where the leaders sit. And their meeting is a side event while the leaders meet on their own. I think that these kind of spaces have to be spaces for direct interaction between and amongst leaders and people who are led or who are subjects of these leaders. The third thing is this, that we look at the democracy project as a project. And so when we are giving funding and support to democracy activists, it's a project based on a proposal for 5 years. It's short-term view, and yet we know that this work is a marathon. You're fighting entrenched systems that have the luxury of time and resources, and yet our response to them is a project response. And so viewing democracy work and investing it as a long-term strategy in ways that allow people who are fighting for democratic governance in their countries to focus on the work is going to be a very important thing that we all must do.
Thank you so much. I love the idea of raising costs. I mean, you mentioned global Magnitsky. That's another way the international community can coordinate. Precisely the point of sanctions from one country are a lot less meaningful than sanctions from multiple countries, so that these autocratic actors do not have entry points into multiple other economies. I think something that's also important is global Magnitsky covers human rights. It also covers corruption, but most other countries do not have a corruption prong for global Magnitsky. They are afraid or don't have the political will to implement that corruption prong, which also captures a lot of autocratic actors and bad behavior that impacts human rights defenders. I will also say I love the idea of performing democracy rather than practicing democracy. I think many of us have been in this room where we measure a democracy by the fact of holding an election or what an international observer report may say, which may or may not be accurate. And how do we measure the quality of democracy? It is often things that we think are boring, like the performance of public administration and the health and freedom and financial stability of civil society. There are a lot of factors to measure the health of society that oftentimes the project-based international donor-type funding does not take into consideration. And I think those of us who have seen at least the United States appropriations process and how democracy assistance is funded is that it is deeply, deeply ingrained in how donor governments work and budget their resources that really works institutionally against having sort of a longer-term project for democracy. So I want to use that longer-term project for democracy lens to ask you a follow-up question, Nicholas, which is, over your career, you've seen a full range of human rights and democracy repression in Uganda. You've advocated for some of the most marginalized groups. You've been an expert on electoral processes. You've been at the forefront of a new favorite tool of authoritarians, which is digital repression. And recently, your organization, Chapter 4, celebrated that the crime of offensive communication in Uganda was ruled unconstitutional. So given all of these issues, I wanted to ask you, what's the most important, most urgent, emerging authoritarian tactic whether in Uganda or across the world, that you see, that you think both human rights defenders and the international community needs to pay more attention to?
Closing civic space, both on and offline. Huge investments and commitments have been expended in closing the civic space, both online and offline. And I can tell you, in Uganda now, politicians and human rights defenders are very happy to hear about a FINRO, because perhaps at a FINRO is the only place you have the freedom to speak without consequences. Because any other form of public gathering will be met with violence from the state. And I can tell you as well that Facebook has been banned in Uganda for the last 3 years. And it is business as usual, precisely because social media had become a space for organizing. For some reason, Twitter has still survived. But you can imagine the fury with which the state has gone after activists trying to use digital tools, oftentimes the only tool available to them to push back against repression. And so closing civic space is the number one, I think, in my view, pressing priority for many human rights defenders on the continent. Many of them are facing prosecutions, but are also victims of nefarious use of technology to spy on them, to impeach their integrity, invade their privacies. And I can speak about that for weeks on end. The Americans know this too well because Pegasus, the Israeli software, was used to hack into the phone of the ambassador and her key staff in Uganda. But that has been happening in civil society for months on end. So the closing of civic space. The second thing really for me is the absence of accountability. And for those who are involved in peace work, this is one of the triggers for conflict. When communities feel year after year that they are victims of injustice, that are never addressed and never investigated, they tend to, at some point, take it upon themselves. And you can see this now happening in the country, that people are becoming more radicalized in the way they engage and encounter state security agencies during protests. It is not because they are violent inherently, but it is because they have pent-up anger and frustrations arising from several incidents of unresolved violations. And in Uganda, I mentioned Kasese, you have Walk to Work. In 2011, you have the Buganda riots in 2009, where the state just killed people. The last election where that really got me in problems when the state got onto the streets and in extrajudicial killings on November 18th and 19th, shot and killed hundreds of people, largely in central Uganda. So the question of accountability arising from incidents of past violations, I think for me is a bigger trigger for violence and a threat to peace on the continent. In my view, those two things are really, really pressing, and unless we can address it. The last one, which is also important, but that I think will be resolved either by nature, is the problem of long-serving leaders. 3 examples to share. You saw a video doing the rounds of the president of South Sudan at a national function, easing himself in public, unaware that he was passing urine from his pants at a public function. Or at the US-Africa summit here, the president of Cameroon looking confused, unaware of where he was and what he was doing. Long-serving African leaders are the biggest problems to many African communities because for them, this is an entitlement, they're complacent, and that comes with corruption, state patronage, and violence against the population.
Thank you, Nicholas. You touched on what I would call so many of my least favorite issues. But I think closing civic space has been with us for many, many years. And I think it's easy to sort of become complacent and turn to what we think are new and emergent issues, when in fact, one of the newest and most emergent issues is how the closing of civic space is changing and evolving in the online space, and how in the most repressive environments in the world, especially for myself, representing the Project on Middle East Democracy, a huge portion of the most impactful democratic actors are operating on the online space. They simply can't go outside. They, like you were saying, Nicholas, would be hurt, killed, persecuted, imprisoned if they went outside to exercise these rights. So they're turning online and they're now being met with the same thing: persecution, imprisonment, doxing, threatening on the internet, laws being passed that your behavior on Twitter and elsewhere can put you in prison. So I think that's really, really important to highlight. I think also the issue of spyware. We're facing a situation where there's going to be a center of excellence for artificial intelligence in a place like the United Arab Emirates. How do we feel about that as an international community, that an authoritarian Gulf state is going to develop the norms for the use of artificial intelligence? It's these sorts of issues that I think keep many of us awake at night, that are both globally impactful and literally harm human rights defenders and those in civic space every day. I think the absence of accountability is something great to mention. The nexus between democracy, human rights, and peace building. Oftentimes those communities are completely siloed from one another. But drivers of conflict are often deeply, deeply related to human rights grievances and chronic governance failures. And so I definitely think you're right, Nicholas, that without resolving those issues about accountability, forget democracy, we're not going to see peace and stability. And that actually made me think of, without accountability, that's an important issue, because eventually these longstanding leaders will die. Eventually, autocracies end, they evolve, they change, and what happens next? And if you don't have a cadre of human rights defenders, of effective political parties, of effective civil society, what happens when these autocracies inevitably, at some point, sooner or later, fall apart? And so I think these are serious questions that get to what Nicholas mentioned of long-term planning for democracy support. Is it has to be a long-term project, because in essence, the building and defense of democracy is long-term. This makes me turn to you.
If I can say one last thing.
Please.
From my experience, autocrats fear exposure. There used to be a saying that they've lost a sense of shame. But from my experience, when you carefully document these violations, in Uganda now, the thing they fear the most is the phone, because you can use the phone to document atrocities. Practice carefully documenting these violations, even when it appears hopeless at the moment, that you're unable to get any solution to them. But that's having the record that when the time is ripe, an individual will be held to account is really important, and impacts on the behavior of state actors in ways that are so profound. And I've seen this in real life. People's behavior has changed because they have been exposed as being involved in human rights violations. So even if you're frustrated about lack of accountability, we must not give up on the project of carefully documenting human rights violations, because as sure as day follows night, time will come when there'll be need for accountability, when state protection is lost, and the moment of reckoning, is here, and we have to hold them to account. So the investment in documenting human rights violations is an important project for the immediate and long-term future for any democracy.
Thank you for that excellent point, and that also ties in with conflict prevention and conflict resolution, which is whether it's about individual abuses or genocide or widespread war or conflict. Accountability is often a long-term project. Like you said, it may not be immediate. It may happen years and years later. And having that evidence is also something that the international community can support in a better and more coordinated way, and invest resources in it, in civil society and local actors that keep that information. Going back to the global Magnitsky point, things like sanctions and other punitive measures often rely on documentation from local civil society actors, period. It relies on deep benches of localized information. The governments are often not relying on their own sources of intelligence or information. The most reliable and in-depth information is for people in the country. So that is such an excellent point. Thank you, Nicholas. I'm going to turn to you, Nino. I mean, we've talked about a lot of depressing trends now, and we touched on a lot of how in times of democratic transition, there are not just these sort of internal autocratic threats, but external as well. And so, as you mentioned, Georgia has undergone this long and volatile sort of democratic transition. It's backslid as well. And in addition to quite clearly the 2008 Russian invasion, there have been influences, interventions from your autocratic neighbors repeatedly in many different forms since then. So I wanted to ask you, what's the best way for human rights defenders, international community to build resilience against these foreign malign threats?
Okay, yes,
Your mic.
Well, yes, influence of Russia propaganda is increasing in Georgia, and Russian-backed far-right extremist groups or political actors are very active in Georgia, especially in recent years. In last years, they became very, very active, and they are influencing the dynamic of Georgian politics nowadays. I think that, I have already discussed this trend and said that Russian propaganda is very strong, very well coordinated. They have their own media resources, they have their political actors there, or like so-called civil society groups. I think that they have very well tested like messages in their hands that they are using in various countries. Mostly those, propaganda messages are like very populistic. What Russian propaganda tries to do is to demonize the Western actors in like Georgia, for instance, in other countries, to stigmatize civil society actors, democracy, like activists, human rights defenders, free media. Yes, they are quite strong in propaganda. What we can do is to maybe learn from them how to successfully confront those problems and challenges that comes from Russia propaganda. That's why I was saying that the countermeasures requires much better and much stronger coordination. One thing that I wanted also to mention is that autocratic regimes, they are taking risks. They have their own agenda. They know what they are doing, why they are doing, whom they are targeting, why they are targeting. And on the other side, we are placed in a defense position. In us, I mean like domestic actors and international democratic actors. We try to, defend ourselves, say that, no, we are not foreign agents. We are not, international community tries to, explain in response to this propaganda that they are not providing support to the, groups of people who want, government who want to change the government in the country, which is not the policy that brings positive changes in the country. In order to be successful, we have to take an initiative. We have to have our own agenda, and we have to risk. It requires courage. It requires more coordination, and requires like very concrete vision and plan. And yes, we should recognize that, yes, we are doing this because we want to have changes in the country. So this is something that now we should confess ourselves and it's not bad if you want to bring changes in the country. If you see that there is democratic backsliding, you should not keep blind eye on those things. And I think that it is, yes, obligation and duty of international democratic community to interfere when you see that there is clear signs of autocracy in a particular country. It is, I think that this is an obligation. This means that you are really, committed to those values that the Western civilization, recognizes. So this is what I expect from international community, and this is what I lack, actually. I'm not saying that there is no support, that there is no funding or things like that, but I'm saying that this strategy of providing this support needs to be revised, and I think that international community should take more courageous steps and to be very clear that yes, we are providing support to those who can bring changes to the country.
Thank you. And I love this message that both Nino and Nicholas have said repeatedly, which is the bravery and courage, not just of human rights defenders, but of the international community and allies and supporters to be braver, more courageous, more creative, to take more risks, because autocratic partners are definitely taking those risks. So I love that message. I also think, having our own agenda, democratic agenda of like-minded states and actors is so important. I think the mention of defining our narrative. We've all heard, I feel like I've heard 1,000 times Russia say that their direct interference and their direct undermining of democracy is the same thing as the activities of NDI and IRI, the party institutes of the NED, of funders and supporters of impartial, apolitical support across the world. And that's a narrative that even some of our allies buy into, that they don't know better. And so I think there is that component of messaging that there is a qualitative, serious difference between malicious autocratic interference and undermining of democracy and authentic support to civil society and people in their own countries driving democratic change. So that's the narrative component. And then I would also say there needs to be that active support that Nino mentioned of really moving past what Nicholas mentioned, because they're so brilliant. They're talking about the same topics, that we need to close the gap between rhetoric on human rights and democracy support and practice. And I think we see that. Nicholas mentioned the Africa Leaders Summit. There is a Summit for Democracy. These are meaningful events and engagements by the US government and other governments, but there is still a massive gap between the rhetoric of commitment to democracy and the actual tools and interventions that international partners are willing to provide. So continuing on that topic, I just wanted to ask you, especially given your extensive experience in elections, especially since donors are often so focused on elections, the international community, the region is focused on the importance of free and fair elections. What do you see as the key sort of modern threats to elections, and what can we do about them?
It's a really important but difficult question to answer. Well, tricky thing about elections is that, of course, this is the best form to express the will of the population and to translate the public support into the representation. But on the other hand, if elections are manipulated, and if the outcome of the manipulated elections receives recognition and legitimacy, especially from the West, this is... elections, in that situation, election might strengthen the autocracy and provide legitimacy to autocracy. So I think it is very, very important how the democratic society, international community reacts on problematic elections. Well, difficult thing about the modern elections and how the elections are manipulated or influenced is that, nowadays, at least in Georgia and countries like Georgia, you don't see on election day the massive and widespread ballot stuffing and kidnapping or things like violence at the polling stations, etc. More or less everything is quiet and well organized. But thing is that pre-election period before elections are critical, And what we are witnessing is that, at least in Georgia, we have widespread misuse of administrative, human, and financial resources, pressuring and intimidating voters through the law enforcement. Through this instrument. Also, vote buying is quite widespread. And although domestic election observer groups and international observers are identifying and documenting dozens or maybe hundreds of such cases when people publicly speak up and say that, yeah, I've been, yes, I was intimidated, I was pressured, and etc. The response from the government to these election observer groups is that, okay, you have documented 100, for instance, cases, or several dozens cases. How can you prove that 2 million or 3 million persons took part in the elections? How can you prove that those 200-300 cases influenced the elections? And obviously, international observer organizations or domestic election observer groups, they cannot provide the proof that those cases, those incidents, we cannot measure how much influence those kind of manipulations might have over the outcome of the elections. Another thing that we have to take into account is that nowadays autocracies and autocratic regimes, they do not need to falsify or manipulate 50, 30, or 80% of the elections. Sometimes a manipulation of 3% or 5 or 10% maximum is absolutely enough to change absolutely change the outcome of the election. So when we see that there is the regimes need just few percent to influence and manipulate and falsify. And when you see that this is happening, but still the international observer organizations writing down in their reports that, well, overall, the elections have been conducted in an organized manner. There were problems in 5% of precincts, but it might not have influence over the overall outcome of the elections. I think this is outdated assessment and not. This works for autocratic regimes, and they know it. And they are using this, they know the methodology of international and domestic election observer groups. They know that they are not going to, they don't have this flexibility to have more bold assessment of the elections, and they are using this in favor of for them. And this kind of assessments brings legitimacy to the problematic elections. I think it needs to be changed. I think that domestic and international observer groups should have more flexibility in their assessments, and the local context needs to be taken into account. And once again, there are countries where big part, majority of the outcome of the elections is falsified. And when you see that in other countries, maybe 5 to 10% is problematic, and when you say that it is okay, at least not 50% was problematic, but that's the wrong attitude and wrong assessment, because you should measure not the percentage of the manipulation, but the impact of this manipulation over the electoral outcome. So probably this is where election observer groups and organizations are making, and international community is making mistake. And also another thing that I wanted to mention is that after problematic elections, when the international democratic world continue doing business as usual with the governments of those countries which conducted problematic elections, this is another way that strengthens autocracies and that legitimizes their power. And this also needs to be revised, I think so. And the regime should pay price for problematically conducted elections.
Thank you so much, Nino. I think that brings us back to a point that Nicholas mentioned as well, is that when you're violating human rights and violating the integrity of election, there should be consequences. There should be consequences from the international community. There should be consequences to bilateral relationships. And often there aren't. I think the focus on the pre-election environment is also really important. The interference, the undermining of elections becomes more sophisticated over time, and it spreads through the democratic system, right? It's about corruption. It's the misuse of public resources. It's about intimidation from security forces, which is much wider than an elections issue. It's a democracy and everyday society issue that should not be stovepiped as just an elections issue. So I do want to give Nicholas also an opportunity to answer this question about election threats and sort of actions that we may be able to take given your context from Uganda, which of course has also had its fair share of really problematic and violent elections, including a lot of pre-election abuse, right?
The favorite line by people like President Museveni is that election is equating elections to voting day. Mm-hmm. You have voted, go home, wait for the next 5 years, right? Anything in between, you're engaged in politics, let's get back to work and deliver on what people need. I think we must have a coherent response to this kind of narratives because that becomes the MO for how governments are run. I think that the next election begins the day after the last one. And planning, interventions, observations start right away the moment the last election ends. In how do we prepare? And oftentimes we wait until the end. So, Nigeria is having elections in February. So in November of the year before, we then begin to scramble and say, what do we do about Nigeria? By that time, oftentimes it's too late. Everything else has been done. And so it's really important that we begin to think about elections as part of a democratic life and system of a nation. In Uganda, the president appoints the electoral commission, as an individual without, any recourse to any other institution. He has the sole power to dismiss them. And so he staffs the whole system with all manners of loyalists whose sole intention is to make sure he wins the election. The second thing is really that electoral systems, just like systems for anything else like banking, are still being run on Western tools. And we've got to look at these processes. We print our ballots in France. We use BVR systems and IT systems. While those things have their own problems, they also present for us, I think, an opportunity of how can we look at these systems and use them to be able to detect, prevent, if we can, or to hold to account systems that are not transparent. I think the example of Kenya was really very important, that when the lawyers wanted to have the data to challenge the election before the Kenyan Supreme Court, they discovered the data was being held somewhere in Europe and they couldn't get it because of proprietary interest. And so we've got to look at the role of technology and how we can use that to ensure that elections, because they still run on Western systems. Even if President Museveni would staff the Electoral Commission with soldiers and loyalists, they still want to print their electoral materials abroad. They use these systems. That itself, I think, is an opportunity that we can seize upon. The last one is really the question of, and I'm speaking here in my heart as a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. It's an important movement of global actors who are committed to defending our democratic values and processes. I think increased investment and building of these systems are going to be really important, that we strengthen the hand of the World Movement for Democracy to be able to, for example, revive, revitalize, and make active regional pro-democracy groups. The African Democratic Forum was a powerful forum, but I think it's diminishing over time. And to speak very candidly, I think that we can do a whole lot more to strengthen these regional forums, to provide a space for a community of practice, a community of actors who are able to, share experiences and help each other. And so building a global movement of democracy actors, again, it's a long-term investment, deliberate, and I think that it's an opportunity, especially with young people. I often speak about Uganda. We have a population where 78% of the population is below the age of 35. Many of these guys, if not all of them, were born after Museveni came to power. And they are yearning to imagine a new country. But they're also working in this atmosphere of extreme destitution and can be hired for anything else. And unless we pounce on that opportunity and use the energy of the youth, the numbers, to be able to reimagine the country, we have a group that can be used otherwise. I always joke and say we are a very youthful country where the 1% leads the country in terms of age brackets. The oldest of us all is leading the country. If you look at the guys who are running the country. So the oldest guys are leading the vast majority who are, the youngest people. And yet, I think the reverse should be true. We have more stakes in the future. There is an opportunity. Unless we seize upon it, it can be used for nefarious purposes. Young people and their numbers.
Thank you, Nicholas. That's so many great points about examining the use of tech, not just in elections, but democracy generally. I really like the mention of a community of practice internationally, but also regionally, and activists and pro-democracy actors learning from each other within regions is so vital because the tools of authoritarians are often common across borders. And so learning not just from those in your country, but others. And then I really like the focus, I think, that both of you had on the sophistication of tools increasing. Nicholas, your focus on engaging with youth. That's one of my favorite issues because, as we all say, authoritarians will die. Rule will end, and what's next? And so I think from a very fundamental perspective, it's really critical to examine the role of youth. Thank you so much, Nicholas. We are a little bit over time, so first I want to thank you for all of your patience and your kindness for sitting here past 5 p.m. I want to thank our fabulous panelists, Nino and Nicholas. Please give them a round of applause for being brilliant, giving us lots of good ideas. So I just want to release you with the thought of all of the great lessons learned they both shared, which is that we need to build a democratic narrative to counter the false authoritarian narrative. We need better coordination among donors. We need to raise the cost for authoritarian and anti-democratic behavior, and we need to make early, sustained, and long-term support to building democracies. I think those were all major points you raised. I want to thank you both and thank the audience.
Thank you for